ECIC, your export risk partner.
And so we move on to the final discussion of today's Africa Trade South Africa virtual conference, where we have been exploring trade and investment opportunities offered by the African Continental Free Trade Area. We've said we're looking at opportunities that are ripe for the picking from a South African perspective, and all our conversations have reflected that. Once again, my name is Nozipoho Tshabalala, and once again, it's a pleasure to moderate this important conversation. Now, the African Continental Free Trade Area opportunity we know is unprecedented. We know that it's the largest free trade area in the world since the formation of the World Trade Organization, representing a combined GDP of more than $3.4 trillion and counting. It is estimated that the agreement will further boost intra-Africa trade by 52% by 2022, and trade integration could triple trade and investments. But, and it is a big but, for all of this to be true, Africa has to develop and invest in infrastructure to enable the African Continental Free Trade Area. And so in this conversation, we're going to be looking at unpacking the infrastructure gaps that still exist. And we're going to be asking the courageous questions about how exactly are these gaps going to be closed. And so, to introduce my panelists right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Kosi Taolasi. He is the head of program development at AUDA-NEPAD. A big welcome to you. Madam Musa Tshabalala is the Group Chief Executive Officer at the Gauteng Growth Development Agency. Thank you for being here, Musa. We're joined by Mr. Hastings Chikoko. He is the Regional Director for Africa, and this at the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. And thank you, sir, for being here. And last but certainly not least in this conversation is Mr. Lovemore Bingandadi. He is the SADC Secretariat looking after Infrastructure and Services Directorate. He also is a Program Manager or Technical Advisor to the Tripartite Transport and Trade Facilitation Program. So a massive welcome to all of you. And maybe I'm going to start off with Mr. Lovemore, simply because if in your capacity as technical advisor, you have a bird's eye view of the big issues that are on the agenda that are either enabling or hindering the free trade area on the back of the infrastructure gaps that we want to unpack. And so the question to you, sir, is what are the big issues that are dominating the infrastructure development agenda in the region? And from your view, do you get a sense that where there are bottlenecks, there is enough political will to overcome them?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Indeed, the main challenge that we are addressing at SADC as the regional economic community, coordinating the regional activities of our 16 member states, is the implementation of the Regional Infrastructure Development Master Plan. The master plan is a blueprint of the key and major infrastructure projects that need to be implemented in order to improve regional integration, economic development, and to promote trade. It covers energy, transport, ICT, and transboundary water. It is that project that then defines the priorities and the sequences of projects that member states have agreed to implement. Its mere adoption by SADC member states is an expression of the political will and commitment of member states to collaborate. So in terms of political will, we can confirm that we have it in abundance, as recently demonstrated by a number of regional projects that have been launched, such as the Kazungula one-stop border post and bridge. Thank you.
Lovemo, I think it's a very good start to our conversation, and maybe I just want to double click on what I've heard. You've spoken about the adoption of the master plan as indicative of the political will, but you've also started off by saying it's the implementation of the master plan that appears to be a challenge. I'm keen to understand what are the underlying causes that make it difficult for us to translate plans into tangible realities when it comes to infrastructure development, and what plans are there that you're seeing to try and engage with these deficiencies?
The first challenge in implementing that master plan is the slow pace of project preparation. We have got a number of projects, most of which are at a conceptual stage. The challenge there being the lack of capacity in the member states to prepare projects. Project preparation requires a multiplicity of skills. We need skills of engineers, financial experts, and legal experts to frame the required legal and institutional processes. But more importantly, because our governments do not have sufficient financial resources for project preparation and project implementation, there's therefore a need for collaboration with the international cooperating partners, with private sector through the various financial institutions. So getting everyone to coordinate and collaborate is one of the biggest challenges that we face currently.
I think you've put some of the biggest issues on the table, the absence of skills, the need for more courageous financing, but also for the collaboration that allows us to draw in the private sector, but as well as international partners. All of these, of course, are issues that I'm hoping that we're going to look further into the conversation. Maybe let me go to beyond the region and take on a more continental frame by going to Kosi with the next question. From a continental perspective, Kosi, what are you seeing as the biggest infrastructure challenges, and what impact are these challenges having on trade in the continent, and the likelihood that we might be able to hit that 52% trade by 2022? Does that sound too optimistic given the infrastructure challenges that we still have today?
Yeah, thank you very much. I believe that we have a serious challenge on the continent in order for us to achieve or the plan, they reach the 52% target will be very, very unsurmountable challenge. Because look at what is happening at the continental level. The type of infrastructure we have are geared to export of raw material. They are not geared to regional trade. So we need to look at how best we can structure our financial model that will support the construction of road and bridges that will help us to move from exporting our raw material to now trading within ourselves. This means that at the level of continental, we need to have a facility that will enable us to be able to prepare our project, meaning that facilities to ensure that we have a sound project that are bankable. That has been the challenge that we have right now on the continent. And also looking at the banks that we have, for instance, development bank that we have about 68 national development banks, which are now marketable at the level that we can say they have a high capitalization to be able to support the infrastructure project on the continent, except DBSA that have about 5.3 billion. The rest are below 500 million in terms of capitalization. There is need to be able to ensure that we have a better capitalization of development banks. Even at the level of African Development Bank, the capacity to loan is about $20 billion a year, compared to other countries, other continents like Asian Development Bank. They have about 95 to 96 billion. And Inter-America Development Bank, they have about 82 billion. So we still struggle a little bit, and we are behind other continents in terms of the availability of resources. Of course, one can say that there are other means to be able to ensure that we have the resources. But the point is, unless we redesign our business, our plan in terms of how we are able to implement projects on the continent, we will not be able to achieve that target. So it is important for us to look holistically at key infrastructure projects that we have that will enable us to be able to reach the target of 52%. It's reachable in a way if you are able to meet those key challenges, resolving them, working together as one at the level of the continent to ensure that we can be able to implement those key projects that are very important for us at the level of the continent to ensure that we can meet the 52% target. Thank you.
Kosi, you've put some very big but very important conversations on the table. On the one hand, the tradition of exporting raw materials, of course, ties back to the earlier conversation around industrialization and bolstering the manufacturing sector. But I would imagine that in the African context, this is a conversation we've been having for decades. And so as a follow-up question to that is, what is it that is stopping us from beneficiating and making sure that we're adding value and that we're actually enabling our manufacturing sector? I want to park that as an issue because I do hope that we can come back to it. But in addition to that, you've put forward the issue of capitalization. And if indeed our development finance banks, whether it's the DBSA or the African Development Bank, are just not well capitalized, what can we do about that? I'm keen to understand, how do we solve for some of these gaps? And so maybe if you could just give us a quick comment to say, what is the big thinking around how we overcome the capitalization challenge, but also what is the big thinking around how do we kickstart the manufacturing sector so that we can really begin to see that exporting of raw materials as a tradition really wane and hopefully come to an end?
Thank you. Before I answer those questions, when we talk about financing infrastructure, sometimes we don't have the idea about how much it takes to finance those kind of projects. Annually, we're looking at about 130 billion to 180 billion a year, which can be divided into key strategic areas in terms of infrastructure. Transport, for instance, you look in the range of a maximum of 47 billion a year. And sometimes the commitment from member states and other partners are below that. You look at 31 billion. And therefore, you have a gap in the range of 4 to 16 billion. And you look, for instance, at water, which is very key. The commitment of around 56 billion to 66 billion. But then you have a gap of about 53 billion to be able to do that. The same thing for energy, ICT. Overall, if you look at 170 billion or 180 billion per year, then you have a gap of 92 billion. So filling that gap has become a challenge. But it shouldn't be so because there are other avenues. You look, for instance, institutional investors, they like our pension fund. They have a lot of resources. In the continent, they have assets worth over 800 billion that can be put into funding infrastructure. And in the whole world, you look at about 80 trillion. So the issue is not about the resources. The issue is about how do we bring those resources. Therefore, there's a need for institutional or regulatory transformation at the continental level to bring back the trust between investors and the member state. I refer to countries. For instance, if you look at the private sector, which I believe should be the key player in the investment in infrastructure, they only play about 6 to 10% in terms of investment because there is no much guarantee to ensure that the investment will be secure. There's so much red tape along that need to be changed. The way we do business has to be looked at holistically to attract investors, especially the private sectors, to be able to have that confidence and when they invest into our infrastructure, so that they will be able to get back their return on investment. no private investor will put billions of dollars and not knowing that tomorrow they will be able to get back their investment. So the political role has to be there to ensure that member state government are putting in place the required mechanism, regulations and policies that will attract private investors. So the banks have their role to play. We as international institution have our role to play, and the population also has its role to play to ensure that we are able to give the, I would say, conducive environment for the private investors or institutional investors to come and support the banking system. Where the development banks are not able to support that, then they will come in. So we have the opportunity to do that. We have the will to do that, and we are supporting government to be able to achieve that. Over to you. Thank you.
Of course, it certainly sounds like an underlying theme here is that we need to find ways of de-risking the African continental free trade area. As you said, its credibility in our institutions, its robustness of our regulatory frameworks, but also it's about rebuilding trust between the state and the various stakeholders that have the capacity to fund and invest. Let me then move from the continent and let me go to the provincial level in Gauteng, and let me come to Musa with this question. Musa, let's bring the Gauteng region into frame. How is the GGDA helping Gauteng to tap into the opportunities that are offered by the free trade area?
So the first thing that we need to appreciate, which we have not necessarily done well as a continent, is really putting in the work to understand our respective countries. And understanding means understanding the market size of the various countries, understanding the stability, political stability, regulatory stability, understanding exactly what agreements exist between the various countries that are supporting and enabling to advance the ability for us to trade more freely. And of course, then, further to that is the regulatory environments. Because as soon as you start talking about trading between us as countries, you need to be able, so from our perspective as an investment promotion agency, we need to be able to, as we train, and we call it export training, export readiness, for businesses that are based in Gauteng and in South Africa, to be able to trade with other countries on the continent, we need to be able to support and empower them with the information that would assist them to have a soft landing as they, expand their businesses into the various countries. Now, there's a couple of ways that we've done that over and above understanding, the different countries and what opportunities exist for businesses, for South African businesses in those countries. We've also gone then to partner in a more meaningful way with our peers across the continent, so other investment promotion agencies. And we've segmented the continent according to the trade blocks. And we've done that intentionally because it is easier to understand a region in that way from an economic perspective anyway. And then partnering with other investment promotion agencies, because our objective is around the opportunity identification and then the facilitation of those opportunities for Gauteng-based businesses. But equally, what we want to understand is what businesses exist in other countries on the continent that we would be able to provide the same facilitation for in Gauteng. So the partnership with other investment promotion agencies, and that's not just promotion agencies on the continent, although they are the priority, it's other enabling bodies globally as well. So for example, the World Bank, because they do a lot of research and a lot of work on the continent to be able to provide such information. We're also working a lot more closely with our diplomatic community, because it is also equally important to understand, like I spoke about earlier, the bilateral agreements, because our job is not just to participate and tap into those bilateral agreements, but we also need to be able to play a lobbying role where we see challenges in the bilateral agreements that exist. We then have the responsibility to take that data and research that we're doing and information to our respective diplomatic spaces. So in our case in South Africa, to DIRCO, and share that information with them to say, in this particular country or in this particular region, if we were able to introduce certain things, or these are more enabling terms and conditions that you could put into our bilaterals, that's part of the work that's involved in that. Equally, because today's conversation is about the logistical and the infrastructure challenges, is one thing about our province of Gauteng is we have significant economic infrastructure already, which is a great advantage. But that is also an advantage that we need to build on. So on our own as a province, our ability, and I think the two speakers before me spoke very well around it, our ability to increase our manufacturing capability and therefore export capacity is critical. So over and above understanding what opportunities exist on the continent, it's also being able to support businesses that are based in Gauteng to be able to increase their manufacturing capability. And that is everything from processing, etc. Because like the first speakers mentioned, we are more geared towards exporting our raw materials. And so it is incumbent on us as provinces and as countries to be able to increase that economic infrastructure within our own parameters, within our own borders. So for us, it's everything from improving the telecommunications infrastructure, utilities, road and logistics, transport and logistics infrastructure, to be able to provide an enabling environment to increase our manufacturing capability and therefore our export capability.
Musa, if I could pause you there, simply because I think you've put so much on the table and I don't want to lose any of it, and I'm hoping that we can come back to it. I mean, one of the biggest points that you've raised is the importance of actually understanding the markets that we're trying to integrate, and it's a very important point in the light of, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report that I think many have relied on for many years, also coming to a halt. What opportunities does this open up in order to have maybe a more African instrument that can help us do that? You've also spoken about, as you speak about the facilitation of market opportunities, what stands out for me, especially in the context of this conversation, is that as the Gauteng province enables these market opportunities for Gauteng and South African-based businesses, but also, I would imagine, brings in opportunities from different companies and businesses on the continent, that work of building on the infrastructure that already exists becomes increasingly important. And maybe just as a quick follow-up to you, Musa, what are the 3 or 4 key infrastructure priorities that you think would really make a fundamental difference to how the Gauteng province lives up to the promise of being a gateway to the continent, but also facilitating inbound investment for African businesses looking for opportunities in South Africa?
Great question. And I'm going to respond to the question by actually explaining how, as a province, we are increasing our economic infrastructure capability. So we have a multi-tier special economic zone strategy that we are
All right, I'm going to just pick it up there, a technical gremlin, but we're hoping Musa is going to come back to us. While we do that, let's go to Mr. Hastings. Hastings, let's come to you. We're moving from the province and we're taking on the perspective of cities now. And one of the things that Musa had already spoken about was the trade logistics and the infrastructure that underpins those logistics. How does investing in cities contribute to better trade logistics and infrastructure, Hastings?
Thank you. So cities are really the hub of economic and trade, economic activity and trade. So really, when you look at the city logistics, when you look at the transportation of goods, you find that cities provide transportation nodes. This is where different modes of transport actually converge, whether it's a sea route, or whether it's air and road, they converge in cities. Therefore, when we invest in cities, basically we are creating a dependable distribution network that will move our goods faster and efficiently. And this is the reason why different development partners should consider working with cities to ensure that the urban transport infrastructure is solid and it's dependable. But when you also invest in cities, you are ensuring dependable production centers. Most of the industries are located in cities or closer to cities. Therefore, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure is actually key to driving those production centers. And if you look at some of the risk assessments by chambers of commerce, they actually are listing now that energy access and water access is one of the, or two of the major risks to actually production. So investing in cities, ensuring that there is energy, actually does facilitate production. But also cities, this is where most of the trade facilitation offices of different industries are located. And for this trade facilitation to occur, we need to ensure that we have communication infrastructure in these cities. So we are talking about really using fiber cable connection, and really dependable internet access in cities, so that we can facilitate international communication. We can even facilitate online trading. Finally, we need to also focus on innovation and research. And most of the innovation centers, most of the research centers are located in cities. And countries that help their cities to foster knowledge-based activities, they actually also promote product development. And trade basically relies on the kind of diversity of products that you put on the market. So to me, investing in cities, of course, I'm biased, but investing in cities is a no-brainer. We need, in terms of trade facilitation, in terms of infrastructure development. And we shouldn't just talk about infrastructure deficit. We should actually also realize that in Africa, Africa is home to aged infrastructure we inherited from colonial days. So we also need to look at, besides closing the deficit, we also need to look at maintenance of the aged infrastructure in cities.
Hastings, it's an excellent response, but I do want us to maybe we said we're going to ask some courageous questions. I mean, you spoke about water infrastructure, energy infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, innovation and research as a form of infrastructure. I'm keen to get a sense from you whether you think we're doing a good job from a South African perspective. Just today, we've had massive power outages in some parts of the Johannesburg area. Water, we know that we've experienced droughts in the last, a couple of years ago, and more prevalent in Cape Town. The maintenance of infrastructure remains a question mark when we begin to analyze the spending of municipalities. And so I'm asking you to give us an honest assessment of how are we really doing against investing in cities as a way of investing in infrastructure and trade logistics, and what needs to be true for us to do a better job?
You know, we do have policies, we have frameworks, we do have conducive legislative environment, we do have strategies that are in place. What we need to do more is to basically walk the talk. So we basically need to translate the aspirations that are in different policy frameworks and development plans into action. And this is what the previous speakers were talking about, implement. And how do we ensure that we implement? We need to ensure that we are putting money where our aspirations are. So are we doing enough? No, we need to invest more. We need to, the African Development Bank has actually told us that we need to inject around $90 billion a year to clear the infrastructure backlog in Africa. That's quite a tall order. So we need to ensure that in our fiscus, we make a deliberate allocation towards infrastructure development. We need to do more. We need to create partnerships with development banks and other financing institutions to put more, to bring more to the coffers. But also these partnerships should be with private sector that are there. Finally, the other thing that we need to focus on is the capacity. We have cities that actually do have some capacity gaps. So sometimes to transition from these frameworks to action becomes a problem because of the capacity deficit. So this is where skills improvement issues should come in. So to answer your question, our intentions are clear, our intentions are sound. We have the guidance. We just need to do a bit more and be ambitious to actually translate those aspirations into action.
I'm gonna tap into that ambition, and I'm going to go to Lovemore once again, because Lovemore, you started us off with this idea that we have the plans, we have the strategies, we have the policies, but the challenge remains the implementation for a range of reasons. But one of the reasons that's come back to the surface now is the issue of capacity. And one would argue that sometimes it feels like a chicken or egg scenario. What do you do first? Do you first invest in skills before then you focus on infrastructure development? But also we're saying we don't have the luxury of waiting. We've got to develop the infrastructure now if we want to unlock the benefits of the free trade area. So my question to you is, are African governments innovative enough in terms of how they can close the skills gap? Are we looking at global talent pools as a way of accelerating the closing of that skills gap? Or are we constrained by social and political considerations that make it hard for us to make progress in at the very least, closing the capacity gap that we seem to be experiencing?
Thank you very much. The answer to your question depends from which level or from which lens you are looking at this issue. If you look at it at the national level, you may come to the conclusion that we are not doing enough in terms of developing the required technical and professional skills needed to develop Africa's infrastructure. But if you look at it more broadly, let's say at the level of the region, SADC, or at the level of the continent, a lot is being done. So perhaps what we need to be discussing now is what are the best practices and innovative ways of ensuring that we've got adequate resources and skills to develop and address and close the infrastructure gap. Besides the traditional training, education, and professional development that we undertake as member states, what we now need to do is to go beyond that traditional methodology to introduce new innovative training systems where the multitude of our school leavers and graduates that are unemployed are channeled into industry for practical on-the-job training. I happen to belong to the old school that went through formal apprenticeship systems where, notwithstanding having an university degree, one still had to go through a 2-year management development program where you learned from old and skilled and qualified personnel in the organization. That's one. The second is Africa has got an abundance of skills. They may not happen to be in their own countries. They may be in other countries or part of the so-called diaspora. There's no logical rationale why African governments, individually and collectively, should not make arrangements and incentives and schemes and programs to ensure that the skills that lie in abundance in the diaspora are brought home for the sole purpose of developing Africa's infrastructure. I have seen, for example, the government of Germany putting in place programs and incentives that bring back African skills into Africa to develop Africa's infrastructure. We can replicate those systems and ensure that we optimize and maximize the use of our diaspora skills towards Africa's development.
It's a forward-looking, solutionist-based response, and really appreciated it. So here's an opportunity for us to consider going beyond the traditional approaches to training, to be more innovative around the methods and the training systems, but to borrow from some of the best practices seen in the world. Germany is an example that you've lifted around how do we incentivize attracting the global talent, even if it means as part of the diaspora, back onto the continent, back into the country to contribute to this. And so in the same sense of being solutionist and forward-looking, I want to come back to you, Kosi, and I want to ask the question. We spent quite a lot of time talking about the challenges. If you were to look at the low-lying opportunities that are really within reach and that have the viability to be fundable projects, where do you see the greatest opportunity across the spectrum of infrastructure development?
Thank you. I think when we talk about infrastructure, we need to separate it into two because there's a bit of nuance at that level. For a trader, when you talk about infrastructure, then you talk about standard norms and facilities that will enhance them to be able to trade. And at that particular level, there's quite a number of things that we need to do to ensure that we are able to trade and have a quick win. And being able to, one of them is being able to adopt quickly the standard, the norms of the industry, depending on which kind of industry we are. So for that, there's quite a number of opportunities to be able to bring young entrepreneurs and those who are already in the business to be able to bring the product to the level where it is competitive to other manufacturers outside the continent. That can be done, and it doesn't require much resources to do that. So it's a matter of working with some of the well-developed institutions, for instance, here in South Africa, to be able to train other entrepreneurs across the continent. That can be done through a well-developed program. Also, we need to look at the intra-border trade infrastructure. That's what most of the companies or institutions in Africa are unable to trade between themselves from one country to another. Last time, Dangote was tweeting that it takes 10 days to cross the border from Lagos to Accra. Meanwhile, it's shorter to bring product from Asia to Africa. So the infrastructure at the borders are very critical to also enable us to be able to reach a level where there's a free movement of trade and good. It's very critical for us to be able to do that. If we don't do that, then we'll find ourselves in a situation whereby we are not going to be able to achieve our target of 52%. I keep referring to that because it's very critical. About 2022, we are able to trade within ourselves in the continent and reach that level. So it's at two levels, at the level of standard and norm that will be able to help us to be more competitive on the market, and also at the level of a hard and built infrastructure between cross-border transportation. It could be airline, or it could be by road, or it could be by sea. But the important element is the commitment from member states to commit in investing in cross-border trade, infrastructure at the border, as well as within the region. So regional infrastructure program has to be key for us to be able to ensure that we can, by 2022 and beyond, reach a level where we are comfortable to say that AfCFTA is doing well, that we are succeeding. If we don't focus on those key quick wins, then we will not be able to achieve that. Of course, there are elements that affect member states, for instance, the rate of debt to GDP, that also prevent member states to borrow more money to be able to invest. But we need to focus on what matters most for us on the continent, which means that what can we do to ensure that every citizen of this continent can have a decent life standard, living standard. Also looking at how can we be able to ensure, by taking advantage of AfCFTA, to be able to create more jobs. So these are the factors that we need to take into. Our predecessor has also alluded to how do we increase our training capacity, strengthen the capacity of the institution, as well as also our young graduates. So it's a whole number of elements that we need to put together in a very cohesive way to ensure that as we move from one step to the other, we are able to solve the easiest problem that we have, easiest challenges. It means that we need to be able to reach a level where we understand the key impediment that is preventing us to trade between ourselves. Once we do that, then we're able to reach a level whereby it's going to be easy to trade between countries and between regions. Thank you.
Kosi, it's fantastic. Standard and norms, intra-trade, intra-border trade, but also the commitment to invest into regional infrastructure, notwithstanding the trade-offs that need to be made. I've got less than 5 minutes, and I do want to go back to Musa and then maybe a closing comment from Hastings. Musa, when we lost you, you had just begun sharing with us 3 examples of what the GGDA is doing to build on existing infrastructure. We don't want to lose that. So perhaps if you can come in with that once again.
And I'll be very brief. First of all, the economic infrastructure through special economic zones. So that is the ability to provide world-class infrastructure to investors and to local businesses to be able to produce what they need to produce. The second, though, linked to that is a prioritization of our key growth sectors. So in the province, we've got 10 of those. And as part of the free trade activity that the GGDA does is equally understanding what are the priority sectors in the different countries that we currently are working with, in countries that we would like to create export opportunities for our businesses in. So that means the linkages between the two. And finally is the partnerships, the strategic partnerships. And I think across the board, my colleagues have spoken about it, whether it's with funders, development finance institutions, other governments, etc. But linked to that, though, is why we need to focus on the macro factors and also, the infrastructure needs that have just been outlined by Kosi is we need to, in a parallel process, be building and developing our businesses, our SMEs, to be able to, trade between each other. So building that capacity in a meaningful way and providing other skills around business skills. What are the various business skills, enabling skills to be able to expand? And in that respect, we equally work with other regions globally. So, for example, having meaningful networking opportunities with Southeast Asia, for us in particular, has been Singapore and Malaysia, because they've found a really successful method in bringing technology into the development and support of their SME of their SMEs to be able to enable them to trade in a more meaningful way. So it's important to learn from other countries and other continents where things are working well. We must never forget that technology is going to be one of the key infrastructure capabilities for us as a continent that will either support us in ensuring the effective implementation of the free trade agreement in the shortest possible time. It's taken the European Union 70 years this year to get to where they are. We don't have the luxury of time. So as we build out the larger infrastructure, so the cross-border, etc., it's also about building the infrastructure internally to support the capacity building for our businesses locally.
And it's a fantastic insight as you list out those opportunities, but also highlighting how technology as an infrastructure then becomes the ultimate enabler in really allowing us to fast track and accelerate how we unlock the market. I think I have time for one more question, Hastings. I'd love to bring it to you, and that's to bring in, the possibility that this African Continental Free Trade Area could be a trigger for green industrialization on the continent. How feasible is that idea right now, and how is it being received in the national, regional, and continental conversations?
Thank you. I think to begin with, it's great that we are concluding on that note, because all these discussions we have had, let's note that they are happening within a climate crisis. And COVID-19 has told us what a crisis looks like. So whatever we do, going forward, we need to ensure that we adopt green approaches as possible. Africa has an opportunity. We have an infrastructure backlog, but at the same time, we have the opportunity to learn from the mistakes that we have made, those that have developed infrastructure before us have made. So we can do things better. We can build better. And I think that's the mantra that I want to conclude on. But we should also build to last, because this climate crisis is having serious impacts in the African continent, and that's what the scientific studies are saying. So we should build infrastructure that is resilient, that can withstand the impacts of climate change. Now, is that possible? Yes, it is. It is possible because unlike the days when the infrastructure we have now was developed, right now we have technology. The speakers before me have actually talked about innovation. So we need to tap into the emerging technology, green technologies that we can deploy in Africa. If we are going to have new ports in Africa, they must be green ports. If we are going to ensure energy security for production in Africa, hey, we have the maximum solar capacity in this continent. So the energy must be clean, must be renewable, and not depend on fossil fuels. So the technology is there and the knowledge is there. Lots of research has been done now. Those that developed before us did not have the opportunity of the research that we have. So Africa, this is the time to build, just like those that built before us did, but build better, having learned the lesson, but also build to last, because the impacts are here. We don't want to see road infrastructure being washed away just 2 years after being constructed. And so we need to ensure that the road infrastructure that we have is climate proofed and resilient, with sufficient stormwater drainage systems, so that the trucks can move and not really be blocked by flooding and stay still for 1 week with goods on board because the road is flooded. That's the Africa for the future.
Hastings, I think it's an excellent place for us to close off the conversation. Build back better, but build to last. Let's leverage the green technology. Let's leverage the best practices that we've seen from other countries, but also let's move from planning and actually move towards action and implement. Let's also collaborate and be courageous enough to take on the trade-offs that will allow our regions to come alive, to unlock this free trade area. And from what we've heard today, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa is well poised to unlock these opportunities, but much needs to be done to make that statement true. So it's a big thank you to my guests, a big thank you to Nkosi Taulasi, the head of program development at AUDA-NEPAD, to Ms. Musa Tshabalala, the group chief executive officer of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, Mr. Hastings Chikoko, regional director for Africa, looking at, as well as C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and of course Lovemore Bingandadi, the SADC Secretariat, looking after infrastructure and the Services Directorate, as well as Program Manager or Technical Advisor to the Tripartite Transport, Trade and Facilitation Program. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of today's proceedings. Thank you very much for making the time to join us. Thank you for your engagement. And of course, thank you always for tuning in. This has been a critically important conversation, not only for the country, not only for the region, but certainly for the continent. For myself, Nozipoho Tshabalala, it's been a pleasure.
ECIC, your export risk partner.